On Thursday afternoon, a steady rain settled over St. Mary Mead, turning the narrow lanes dark and shining and driving several villagers toward the one public building where nobody was expected to buy anything in order to remain indoors. By 3 o'clock, the village library was unusually busy, although Mrs. Hartley, who had managed it for nearly 17 years, remarked that half her visitors seemed more interested in the weather than in books. Miss Marple occupied her usual chair beside the window, where the light was good enough for knitting, and the position offered an excellent view of both the circulation desk and the entrance. She had chosen a pale blue wool that afternoon, and although her hands remained occupied, her attention occasionally wandered toward the small movements and conversations taking place around her. There was nothing remarkable about that, because in St. Mary Mead, a library on a rainy afternoon could contain nearly as much information about human nature as it did about history, gardening, or travel. At 20 minutes past 3, Mr. Edmund Vale arrived. Vale had been a solicitor before retirement and still behaved as though every conversation might eventually become evidence. He was a tall, narrow man of 68. With carefully brushed silver hair and the irritating habit of waiting several seconds before answering a simple question, as though considering whether the person who had asked it deserved the truth. He placed a damp umbrella in the stand, removed his gloves, and approached the circulation desk. "I returned it this morning," he said. Mrs. Hartley looked up from her ledger. "I'm afraid you didn't, Mr. Vale." Several people heard the exchange, partly because the library was quiet and partly because Mr. Vale had never mastered the art of disagreeing discreetly. "The Harcourt book," he continued, lowering his voice only slightly. "I put it directly into your hands." Mrs. Hartley's expression changed, although not in the dramatic way that anyone would remember afterward. It was merely a moment of hesitation, followed by the mild irritation of someone being contradicted about a routine she had performed thousands of times. "You brought back 2 books this morning," she said. "Neither was the Harcourt." Vale stared at her. "That is nonsense." Miss Marple looked up briefly from her knitting. Mrs. Hartley opened the returns ledger and turned it toward him, placing one finger beside the entries she had made shortly after 11. Vale leaned closer. Across the room, young Lucy Bell was arranging returned books on a trolley, while Colonel Fenton pretended to read the local newspaper. Near the fireplace, Mrs. Elspeth Crane searched through a gardening volume without turning a page for several minutes. None of them appeared particularly interested in the disagreement. That, naturally, did not mean they were not listening. Vale tapped the ledger. "Then you have made a mistake. I remember perfectly well what you returned." "And I remember perfectly well returning Harcourt." The book in question was an old local history entitled Families and Estates of the Northern Parishes, written nearly 40 years earlier by Reverend Augustus Harcourt. It was neither rare nor especially valuable, and Mrs. Hartley privately considered it one of the dullest volumes in the library. It contained genealogies, descriptions of old properties, and several pages devoted to families that had long since disappeared from the district. There seemed no obvious reason for anyone to steal it. Vale glanced toward the shelves where local histories were kept. There was an empty space between 2 faded green volumes. "Someone has taken it," he said. "Then they would have borrowed it properly," Mrs. Hartley replied. Vale gave a small, humourless smile. "That rather depends upon why they wanted it." The sentence attracted more attention than the argument itself. Lucy Bell stopped moving books for perhaps 2 seconds before continuing. Colonel Fenton lowered his newspaper, then raised it again. Mrs. Crane finally turned the page she had been staring at. Miss Marple continued knitting. Vale said nothing further. He walked to the local history shelf and examined the empty space. Then looked along the neighbouring books as though expecting the missing volume to reveal itself through embarrassment. At 4 o'clock, the rain became heavier. Tea was brought from the little kitchen behind the circulation desk. As it often was on miserable afternoons, Mrs. Hartley poured cups for herself and Lucy. While Colonel Fenton accepted one after protesting that he never drank tea at that hour, Mrs. Crane declined. Vale took his cup without milk. Lucy handed it to him. "Thank you, my dear," he said. It was an ordinary exchange, and precisely because it was ordinary, nobody considered it important. Vale carried the tea into the small reading room at the rear of the library. Before entering, he took a folded newspaper from the table beside Colonel Fenton and tucked it beneath his arm. "You're not finished with that, are you?" Fenton asked. "I shall return it." There was something in the way Vale said those words that made Fenton look after him. At approximately 10 minutes past 4, Mrs. Crane left the library. 5 minutes later, Colonel Fenton went to the front steps to smoke beneath the awning. Lucy disappeared into the storeroom to sort a delivery of donated books. Mrs. Hartley remained at her desk. Miss Marple remained beside the window. And Edmund Vale remained in the reading room. At 4:30, Mrs. Hartley noticed that his tea tray had not been returned. She crossed the library, opened the reading room door and called his name. There was no answer. Vale was sitting beside the writing desk, his body turned awkwardly toward the floor. One hand resting near the empty teacup, the newspaper lay open beside him. His spectacles had fallen onto the carpet. Mrs. Hartley did not scream. She simply stood very still before saying, in a voice so different from her usual one that everyone immediately understood something terrible had happened, "Lucy, please fetch Constable Reeves." The village doctor arrived soon afterward and confirmed that Edmund Vale was dead. What had initially looked like a sudden natural collapse became considerably less innocent when Dr. Hayward examined the remains of the tea and noticed a faint residue at the bottom of the cup. Constable Reeves closed the library. Nobody was permitted to leave. The questions began almost immediately. Who had prepared the tea? Mrs. Hartley, who had carried Vale's cup? Lucy, who had entered the reading room afterward? Apparently nobody, who had reason to wish Edmund Vale dead. At that question, the silence became noticeably less comfortable. Vale had handled wills, property disputes and private family matters for decades. Retirement had not made him forget what he knew. While Constable Reeves concentrated on the cup, the tray and the people who had been nearest the tea, Miss Marple rose quietly and walked toward the local history shelves. She did not touch anything. She merely examined the narrow gap where the Harcourt volume should have stood. On the shelf was a pale, rectangular mark surrounded by a thin border of dust, suggesting that the book had been removed recently. Then Miss Marple looked toward the circulation desk. Mrs. Hartley was telling Reeves once again that Edmund Vale had returned only to books that morning. Miss Marple's eyes moved from the librarian to Lucy Bell, who was standing beside the trolley with both hands clasped tightly together. Lucy was not looking at the dead man. She was looking at the empty space on the shelf. And when Mrs. Hartley repeated the words, "only 2 books," Lucy lowered her eyes. It was a small movement, easily mistaken for distress. Most people in the room did exactly that. Miss Marple did not. Constable Reeves began with Mrs. Hartley, partly because she had prepared the tea and partly because librarians, in his experience, remembered times and movements more reliably than most witnesses. She sat behind the circulation desk with her hands folded over the returns ledger. Still visibly shaken, although her answers came with the precision of someone accustomed to keeping records. She had arrived shortly before 9. Lucy Bell had arrived at 9:30. Edmund Vale had first visited the library at approximately 11:15. Returned to books, spoken briefly with Mrs. Hartley, and left within 5 minutes. "And you are certain there were only 2 books?" Reeves asked. "Absolutely." Lucy, standing nearby, looked toward the floor. Reeves noticed. "You disagree, Miss Bell?" Lucy raised her head to quickly. "No, I mean, I wasn't paying attention." Mrs. Hartley turned toward her. "You were at the desk. I was arranging the new cards." "That is not what I asked," Reeves said. "Did you see Mr. Vale return his books?" Lucy hesitated. "I saw him carrying books. How many?" "I don't remember." It was the first answer that sounded less like uncertainty than caution. Reeves wrote something in his notebook. Miss Marple was seated again beside the window, her knitting resting temporarily in her lap. She appeared to be watching the rain. Reeves asked Mrs. Hartley about the tea. The kettle had been boiled in the small kitchen. Mrs. Hartley had prepared for cups on the same tray, one for herself, one for Lucy, one for Colonel Fenton, and one for Vale. Vale always took his tea without milk but with 1 spoonful of sugar. Who added the sugar? I did. And where is it kept? In the bowl beside the kettle. Could anyone have entered the kitchen? Mrs. Hartley considered this. Anyone could have, I suppose. The door is never locked. That answer immediately widened the problem. Colonel Fenton was questioned next. He was a broad, red-faced man in his early 70s who had spent enough years in the army to regard questions as challenges to be answered rather than invitations to conversation. He admitted that he had known Vale for more than 30 years and disliked him for nearly as long. Why? Reeves asked. Because Vale enjoyed knowing things about people that hardly makes him unique in St. Mary Mead. Even Miss Marple smiled faintly at that. Fenton did not. Knowing things is one matter. Letting people know that you know them is another. He explained that Vale had once represented Fenton's late brother in a complicated property matter. There had been disagreement over a small parcel of land, and, according to Fenton, Vale had retained copies of documents long after the matter was settled. Was there anything in those documents worth killing him over? No. The answer came immediately. Too immediately, perhaps, although Reeves did not comment. He moved on to Mrs. Elspeth Crane, who had already been brought back from her cottage after leaving the library shortly before the body was discovered. Mrs. Crane was a widow of 56, elegantly dressed and careful in her speech. She confirmed that she had been in the library from shortly before 3 until 4:10, and that she had heard Vale arguing about the missing Harcourt book. Did the argument interest you? Not particularly. You stopped reading when he mentioned it. Mrs. Crane's face remained composed. I imagine everyone did. What were you reading? A gardening book. Which one? For the first time, she paused. I couldn't tell you. Reeves looked at her. You spent nearly an hour with a book whose title you cannot remember. I was distracted by the rain. It was a poor answer, and everyone knew it. Mrs. Crane knew it as well. Reeves asked whether she had known Vale personally. Yes. How well? He handled my husband's estate. And did you remain in contact? Occasionally. Were you on good terms? Mrs. Crane looked toward the shelves before answering. Mr. Vale had very few good terms with anybody. When Reeves released her from questioning for the moment, she sat near the fireplace and kept her eyes fixed on her gloves. By then, Dr. Hayward had completed his preliminary examination. The substance in Vale's cup would require proper analysis, but he believed the death was consistent with poisoning, and the timing suggested Vale had consumed whatever killed him shortly after entering the reading room. That made the tea the obvious center of the investigation, perhaps too obvious. Reeves inspected the sugar bowl, the kettle, the milk jug, and every remaining cup. Nothing unusual could be seen. Mrs. Hartley and Colonel Fenton had drunk their tea without ill effect. Lucy had barely touched hers. Vale's cup, however, had contained something the others had not. His sugar, Miss Marple said quietly. Reeves turned. I beg your pardon? You asked Mrs. Hartley whether she put sugar in his tea. Yes, Colonel Fenton takes milk without sugar. I believe Fenton nodded. And Mrs. Hartley takes neither. Mrs. Hartley looked surprised. How did you know? You once told me sugar spoils good tea. Miss Marple returned her attention to the knitting. Reeves examined the bowl again, but if poison had been placed on a particular spoonful of sugar, there was no visible sign of it now. The possibility seemed to point toward someone who knew Vale's habits, that included almost everyone present. Yet the missing book continued to sit at the edge of the case, apparently unrelated to the death. Reeves eventually returned to the argument. What exactly is this Harcourt book? Mrs. Hartley explained its contents and retrieved the catalogue card. The volume had been borrowed by Edmund Vale 9 days earlier. Why did he want it? I didn't ask. Had he borrowed it before? Mrs. Hartley checked the card. No. Miss Marple looked up. Was Mr. Vale interested in local history? Mrs. Hartley gave a short laugh before remembering the circumstances. Not remotely. That changed the atmosphere more than it should have. Vale had borrowed a book on a subject that did not interest him, claimed to have returned it, and died a few hours later while insisting someone had removed it. Reeves asked to see other editions. There aren't any, Mrs. Hartley replied. That is our only copy. Lucy shifted beside the trolley. This time, Miss Marple was not the only person who noticed. Reeves turned to her. Miss Bell, is there something you would like to tell me? No, you keep reacting whenever this book is mentioned. I'm nervous. About Mr. Vale? About everything. It was plausible, but her hands told a different story. They had remained relatively still throughout the questions about the poison. Only when the Harcourt volume was mentioned did her fingers tighten around one another. Miss Marple watched her with the mild, almost apologetic interest she usually reserved for someone who had made a social mistake. Reeves asked Lucy whether she had entered the kitchen that afternoon. Yes, several times. Did you know Mr. Vale took sugar? Everyone knew. Did you dislike him? Lucy swallowed. My father disliked him. The room became quiet. Her father, Thomas Bell, had died 3 years earlier after losing the lease on a small farm outside the village. Vale had advised the landowner during the dispute. Lucy quickly added that this meant nothing. Reeves did not say whether he agreed. The investigation now had its first obvious suspect. And obvious suspects have always been comforting because they allow facts to arrange themselves into a familiar shape. Lucy had access to the kitchen. She had carried Vale's cup. Her family had reason to resent him. She was plainly concealing something about the missing book. By 6 o'clock, Reeves appeared increasingly convinced that those facts belonged together. Miss Marple appeared less convinced. She approached Lucy while Reeves was speaking with Dr. Hayward. My dear, she said softly, you needn't tell me anything. You would rather tell the police. Lucy looked at her. I haven't done anything. I didn't suppose you had. Lucy's eyes filled with sudden tears. Miss Marple glanced toward the empty place on the local history shelf. But you did see 3 books this morning, didn't you? Lucy froze. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Yes." Miss Marple waited. "Emer." Vale brought 3 books to the desk. Lucy continued. "I saw them. The Harcourt book was underneath the other 2, and Mrs. Hartley? She took all 3. Then, why did you tell Constable Reeves you didn't remember?" Lucy looked across the room at the librarian who had employed her for nearly 4 years. "Because Mrs. Hartley said there were only 2, Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "That explains why you were frightened." Lucy shook her head. "No, Miss Marple. That isn't why." Her voice dropped even further. "When Mr. Vale came back this afternoon and started arguing with her, I went to check the shelf myself. The Harcourt book wasn't there. That seems understandable, but I had seen it again after he left." Miss Marple stopped knitting. Lucy looked toward the circulation desk. It was lying beside Mrs. Hartley's ledger. If you enjoy mysteries in which the answer is already present long before anyone understands what it means, you may want to subscribe to the channel, because in St. Mary Mead the smallest ordinary detail often tells us considerably more than the dramatic evidence everyone is watching. Lucy's statement altered the investigation, although not in the way Constable Reeves initially expected. When he was told that the Harcourt volume had been seen beside Mrs. Hartley's ledger after Edmund Vale left the library that morning, his attention shifted immediately from Lucy to the librarian. Mrs. Hartley listened without interrupting. Then she looked at Lucy. "You are mistaken. I'm not. You told Constable Reeves that you couldn't remember how many books." Mr. Vale returned. "I was frightened." "Frightened of what?" Lucy did not answer. Mrs. Hartley's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the injured dignity of someone whose reliability had been questioned in the one place where reliability defined her position. "I have managed this library for 17 years, she said. "I know which books are returned to my desk." Reeves placed the returns ledger between them. "Then, perhaps we should establish exactly what happened this morning." The reconstruction was simple enough. At 11:15, Vale had entered carrying 3 books. Lucy was sorting catalogue cards behind the desk. Mrs. Hartley received the books and spoke briefly with Vale about the weather. He then left. Lucy remembered the Harcourt volume because its brown cover was unusually worn and because Vale had placed it beneath to modern novels. Mrs. Hartley remembered only the novels. More importantly, the ledger supported Mrs. Hartley. Only 2 returns had been recorded beside Vale's name. Reeves examined the handwriting. "You made these entries immediately?" "I always record returns immediately." Lucy shook her head. "Not that morning." Mrs. Hartley stared at her. "You were interrupted," Lucy continued. Mrs. Crane came in. Everyone looked toward Elspeth Crane. She had been sitting near the fireplace throughout the exchange, but now her posture changed slightly. Mrs. Hartley frowned. "Yes, perhaps she did." Mrs. Crane spoke before Reeves could ask. "I came to return a book." "What time?" "A little after 11. "What book?" Mrs. Crane hesitated. "A gardening book." It was the second time she had been unable or unwilling to provide the title of something she had supposedly been reading. Reeves noticed the repetition. "So you approached the desk while Mr. Vale was there?" "He was leaving." "Did you see the books he returned?" "No." Lucy looked directly at her. "Yes, you did." Mrs. Crane's face lost some of its color. Lucy continued. "You picked one up." The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Crane slowly removed her gloves. "I may have moved a book. You opened it," Lucy said. Mrs. Crane turned toward her. "For heaven's sake, Lucy, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I saw you." Reeves stepped closer. Which book did Mrs. Crane open? Lucy pointed toward the empty space on the shelf. The Harcourt book. That was the first moment when the missing volume ceased to look like an inconvenience and became evidence. Mrs. Crane denied taking it. She admitted seeing it on the desk and admitted opening it, but claimed she had done so only because the title caught her attention. Why? My husband's family is mentioned in it? Then you knew the book. Of course I knew it. Half the older families around here are mentioned in Harcourt. Miss Marple, still sitting quietly near the window, asked, "Which page did you look at?" Mrs. Crane turned toward her. "I have no idea. Of course not." Miss Marple's tone was perfectly pleasant. "It was merely that you said the title caught your attention, and people usually look first at the index when searching for a family name." Mrs. Crane said nothing. That small observation did more damage than an accusation would have done. If she had opened the book casually because of its title, there was no obvious reason to remember anything inside it. If she had already known where to look, however, her interest had not been casual. Reeves asked the question directly. "What were you looking for?" Mrs. Crane stared at the fire. "An old entry about your husband." "Yes. What entry?" "A family matter. That is not an answer. It is the only one I intend to give." Reeves reminded her that a man had been poisoned. That finally broke some of her resistance. Her late husband, Charles Crane, had inherited a cottage and several acres outside St. Mary Mead from an elderly aunt. The inheritance had never been particularly valuable, but a recent proposal for a new road had dramatically increased the land's price. Vale had handled part of the original estate. 2 weeks earlier, he had visited Mrs. Crane unexpectedly and asked whether she possessed certain family documents concerning the inheritance. She had told him she did not. Why was he interested? Reeves asked. He wouldn't say, and you believed the Harcourt book was connected? Mrs. Crane looked toward the empty shelf. I wondered. That word mattered. She had not wandered into the library that morning and happened to notice the book. She had known Vale was investigating something, had seen the volume he was using, and had opened it deliberately. Yet she still insisted she had not removed it. Reeves searched her handbag and coat with her reluctant permission. Nothing was found. He then searched the desk, the reading room, and the shelves immediately surrounding the empty space. The Harcourt volume had disappeared. Miss Marple walked slowly along the local history section while Reeves worked. She seemed less interested in the gap itself than in the books around it. After a moment she pulled out a large parish register, glanced behind it, and replaced it. "What are you looking for?" Reeves asked. Nothing in particular. That was rarely a reassuring answer from Miss Marple. By 7 o'clock, the rain had weakened. But nobody had yet been allowed home. Dr. Hayward had sent the teacup for examination, and Reeves had begun constructing a timeline on a sheet of library paper. Vale returned 3 books at 11:15. Mrs. Crane arrived moments later and examined the Harcourt volume. Lucy later saw the book beside the ledger. At some point before 3:20, it disappeared. Vale returned, discovered it missing, and accused Mrs. Hartley of either losing it or lying about its return. At 4 o'clock, Vale drank poisoned tea. At 4:30, he was found dead. The sequence was clear. The meaning was not. Reeves believed the person who removed the book had probably killed Vale because of something it contained. Miss Marple did not disagree. She merely asked, why remove the whole book? Reeves looked at her. To conceal whatever was written inside. Yes, but that is rather cumbersome, isn't it? If one particular page were dangerous, tearing it out would be much simpler. Mrs. Hartley reacted before anyone else. I would have noticed. Miss Marple turned toward her. Precisely, the librarian seemed confused. Miss Marple continued gently. a missing page would tell you exactly where to look. A missing book tells you almost nothing. Reeves considered this. So whoever took it didn't merely want to destroy information. Perhaps then, what did they want? Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she walked to the circulation desk and examined the ledger without touching it. Her eyes settled on the 2 books recorded beneath Vale's name, then moved to the entries immediately below them. Mrs. Crane's gardening book had been recorded at 11:22. Then came another return. A book of sermons entered at 11:24. The borrower's name was Colonel Arthur Fenton. Reeves looked toward him. "You told me you came to the library this afternoon." "I did. Were you also here this morning?" Fenton's expression changed, only slightly, but enough. "No." Reeves turned the ledger around. "Then how did your book get here?" Fenton stared at the entry. For the first time since the questioning began, the Colonel had no immediate answer. Miss Marple watched him for a moment before looking toward the umbrella stand near the entrance. 3 umbrellas remained there from the afternoon rain. One belonged to Mrs. Hartley. One belonged to Lucy. The third was Colonel Fenton's. It was perfectly dry. Colonel Fenton looked at the dry umbrella for considerably longer than the object deserved, and in doing so provided Constable Reeves with an answer before he had actually spoken. "You were here this morning?" Reeves said. Fenton's jaw tightened. "Yes." Mrs. Hartley stared at him. "I don't remember seeing you. You were occupied with Mr. Vale?" Fenton hesitated. With several people, the answer was technically possible. But it was becoming increasingly obvious that almost everyone who had been in the library at 11 o'clock had decided that the morning was best remembered selectively. Reeves asked Fenton to begin again. The Colonel admitted arriving shortly after 11:20, carrying a book of sermons that had belonged to his late sister. He had borrowed it several weeks earlier after finding a reference to their childhood rector inside, although his interest had apparently lasted only a few pages. He had entered while Mrs. Crane was standing near the circulation desk, and Vale? Reeves asked, "Leaving? Did you speak to him?" "No." "Did he see you?" "Yes." That distinction interested Miss Marple. Vale had seen Fenton, but the 2 men had deliberately avoided speaking. Fenton placed his returned book on the desk and left within minutes. He claimed he had concealed the visit because he did not want to become involved in the investigation. Reeves was unimpressed. A man you openly disliked was murdered in a building you visited twice on the same day, and you thought concealing one of those visits would make you less involved. When you put it that way, it sounds foolish. It was foolish before I put it anyway. Fenton accepted the rebuke with surprising calm. Reeves then asked the question that mattered. "Did you see the Harcourt volume?" Fenton looked toward the shelf. "Yes." "Where?" "On the desk." "Did you touch it?" "No." "Did you know Vale had borrowed it?" "No." "Did you know what was in it?" "It is a local history." "I assume local history." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved again. Fenton noticed. "You don't believe me, Miss Marple?" "I haven't said anything. You rarely need to." She smiled apologetically. "It was only that you looked at the book this afternoon before Mr. Vale mentioned its title." Fenton's expression became still. Reeves turned immediately. "You recognized the empty space?" "No, but you looked at it." "I looked at the shelf." "Why?" Fenton exhaled slowly. "Because I had seen Mrs. Crane looking at the same book that morning." Mrs. Crane stood. "That is absurd." "You were holding it when I came in. I have already admitted that you were not merely looking through it. You were reading something very carefully." Mrs. Crane's voice sharpened. "And therefore you decided to lie about being here?" No, I lied because Vale spoke to me outside. That changed the room again. Reeves closed his notebook. You said you did not speak to him inside the library. I didn't. What did he say outside? Fenton looked toward Mrs. Crane before answering. He asked whether I remembered a man named Samuel Crane. Mrs. Crane's face changed instantly. Not dramatically, but enough that the name plainly meant something Reeves saw it. Who was Samuel Crane? My husband's uncle? Was? He died many years ago. Fenton shook his head. That is what I thought. Mrs. Crane turned toward him. What do you mean? Vale asked whether I remembered seeing Samuel after 1948. Mrs. Crane became very pale. Reeves waited. When nobody continued, he asked why the year mattered. Mrs. Crane sat down again. Her husband's, Uncle Samuel, had supposedly died abroad in 1948. He had no wife or children, and part of his property eventually passed through the family to Charles Crane. The land Mrs. Crane now owned had originated in that inheritance. Vale's question suggested that Samuel might have been alive after his recorded death. If that were true, the inheritance could have been based upon false information. And the Harcourt book? Reeves asked. Mrs. Crane answered reluctantly. There is a photograph in it. Everyone looked toward the empty shelf. What photograph? A village fete held in 1950, and Samuel Crane appears in it. I don't know. That was another poor answer. Miss Marple spoke gently. But you suspected he did. Mrs. Crane closed her eyes briefly. Yes, the missing book now had a specific importance. It contained a photograph that might prove Samuel Crane had been alive 2 years after his supposed death. Vale, an experienced solicitor, had discovered the discrepancy and begun asking questions. Mrs. Crane had known what he was investigating. Reeves's theory formed quickly. You saw the book this morning, found the photograph, realized what Vale had discovered, removed the volume, and poisoned him before he could act. No, Mrs. Crane's answer was quiet but immediate. You had access to the kitchen this afternoon, so did half the village. You knew his habits. I knew almost nothing about his habits. You knew enough to fear what he had found. Mrs. Crane stood again. I feared losing my home. Constable. That does not mean I killed a man. Reeves said nothing. The distinction was important, although inconvenient. Miss Marple asked Mrs. Crane whether she had found the photograph that morning. Yes. Was Samuel Crane in it? Mrs. Crane looked puzzled. I thought so. Thought. The photograph was small. There were perhaps 30 people. But one looked like him. Yes, where was he standing? Mrs. Crane tried to remember. Near the back, beside the refreshment tent. Miss Marple nodded. And what did you do then? I closed the book. Nothing else? No, you did not tear out the page. No, you did not take the book? No. Did you tell anyone what you had seen? Mrs. Crane glanced toward Fenton. Oh, Fenton laughed once without amusement. That is another lie. Mrs. Crane looked at him sharply. You spoke to me outside the post office at noon, he continued. You asked whether I remembered the 1950 fete. Reeves rubbed his forehead. The case was beginning to resemble one of those village conversations in which everyone insisted upon honesty while revealing one concealed fact at a time. Mrs. Crane admitted approaching Fenton because he had attended the fete. She wanted to know whether he remembered Samuel being present. And did you? Reeves asked. Fenton shook his head. I remembered the fete. I did not remember Samuel, but you knew him? By sight. Reeves returned to the timeline. At 11:15, Vale returned the Harcourt book. Mrs. Crane examined the photograph. Fenton arrived and saw her examining it. Vale encountered Fenton outside and asked about Samuel Crane. At noon, Mrs. Crane questioned Fenton about the same fate. By the afternoon, the Harcourt volume was gone. There was now a clear reason for Mrs. Crane to remove it. But there was something else. Miss Marple asked Mrs. Hartley to bring the library's old accession catalogue. The librarian retrieved a heavy binder from a cupboard. Miss Marple found the entry for the Harcourt volume. Would the photograph be original to every copy? She asked. Mrs. Hartley frowned. I suppose so. Then, removing this particular copy would not destroy the evidence. Reeves looked at her. There could be other copies elsewhere, certainly. At private houses, other libraries, perhaps even second-hand bookshops, the obvious theory weakened immediately. If Mrs. Crane wanted to suppress the photograph, stealing one library copy accomplished very little. Reeves looked irritated. Then why take it? Miss Marple turned a few pages of the accession catalogue. Perhaps the photograph was not what someone wanted. What else was in the book? That, Miss Marple said, is precisely the question. Lucy Bell, who had remained silent for some time, suddenly spoke. There was something. Everyone turned toward her. When Mrs. Crane put the book down this morning, it opened by itself. Where? Reeves asked. Near the middle, and there was a piece of paper inside. Mrs. Crane looked genuinely startled. I never saw any paper. Lucy shook her head. You wouldn't have. It was farther back? What kind of paper? Reeves asked. I don't know. Folded, yellowish, about the size of an envelope. Did you touch it? No. Did anyone? Lucy thought for a moment. Mrs. Hartley picked the book up afterward. The librarian stiffened. I put it aside to catalogue the return. Did you see the paper? No. Miss Marple looked at her carefully. Not accusingly, but with attention. Then she asked Lucy one more question. When you saw the paper, was it loose? I think so. You think so? Lucy frowned, reconstructing the moment. No. Actually, one corner was caught near the spine. It looked as though someone had pushed it deep inside. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A photograph printed in every copy could not explain why this particular library volume had disappeared. A piece of paper hidden inside this particular copy could. And suddenly the most important question was no longer who had wanted the Harcourt book. It was who had known what Edmund Vale had placed inside it before returning it to the library. The folded paper changed the direction of the investigation more completely than the discovery of poison had done. Until that moment, everyone had assumed the Harcourt volume mattered because of something printed inside it. But Lucy's recollection suggested a much simpler possibility. The book had merely been used as a hiding place. Reeves turned immediately to Mrs. Hartley. You handled the book after Miss Bell saw the paper. I handled dozens of books this morning. This particular one. I may have. Did you open it? I've already told you. I don't remember seeing any paper. Lucy looked uncomfortable. You put it beside the ledger. Mrs. Hartley's patience finally broke. Yes, Lucy. Apparently I did, and apparently you remember every movement I made better than I do. Miss Marple watched the exchange without interruption. There was something revealing in Mrs. Hartley's irritation, although perhaps not what Reeves believed. A frightened person often defended herself against an accusation. But Mrs. Hartley was defending something slightly different, her reputation for accuracy. She seemed almost more disturbed by the suggestion that she had mishandled a returned book than by the possibility that she was becoming a murder suspect. Reeves asked who else had approached the circulation desk before the Harcourt volume. Disappeared. Mrs. Hartley reconstructed the morning carefully. Vale had left first. Mrs. Crane remained for several minutes. Colonel Fenton arrived and returned his book. Two schoolchildren came in to exchange adventure stories. Reverend Pritchard stopped to collect a volume of sermons. At approximately 11:40, Mrs. Hartley went into the office to telephone the county library about an overdue shipment. Lucy remained near the desk. "How long were you gone?" Reeves asked. "Perhaps 5 minutes, and the Harcourt book was still there when you left." Mrs. Hartley hesitated. "I cannot swear to it." Lucy could not either. There had been too much ordinary movement around the desk, which was precisely why the book could have disappeared without attracting attention. Reeves looked toward Fenton. "You were still here?" "No, I had left." Mrs. Crane. "Also gone," Mrs. Hartley said. "Left Lucy's schoolchildren and Reverend Pritchard." The Reverend was summoned from the vicarage. He arrived 20 minutes later wearing a raincoat over an old grey cardigan and seemed more offended by the weather than by being questioned in connection with a murder. Yes, he had visited the library that morning. Yes, he had approached the desk. Yes, he had noticed the Harcourt volume. "Why did you notice it?" Reeves asked. "Because Edmund Vale had asked me about it 2 days ago." Reeves stopped writing. Miss Marple looked up. What did he ask? Whether the parish archives contained burial records for Samuel Crane. Mrs. Crane closed her eyes. The name had returned again. Pritchard explained that Vale had visited the vicarage on Tuesday and asked to inspect several old parish registers. Samuel Crane's burial was not recorded in St. Mary Mead because he had supposedly died in Belgium, but Vale seemed interested in whether any memorial service had been held locally. Was there one? No? Did that surprise him? Not particularly. What else did he ask? The Reverend thought carefully. He asked whether the church had ever received papers from the late Reverend Harcourt that attracted Miss Marple's attention. The author of the missing book, the same man. Harcourt served here briefly before becoming rector at Much Benham. He was an enthusiastic local historian and an appalling organizer. He left papers everywhere, did Mr. Vale say what kind of papers he wanted? No. Did you find anything? Nothing relevant? Reeves leaned back. So Vale was not simply investigating the photograph. Apparently not, Miss Marple said. The distinction mattered. Vale had borrowed the Harcourt book 9 days earlier. He had then visited the vicarage looking for papers connected with its author. He had asked Fenton about Samuel Crane and returned the volume with a folded document hidden near its spine. Whatever Vale had discovered, he had been following it deliberately. Reeves asked Pritchard whether he touched the book when he saw it on the desk. "I moved it." Mrs. Hartley stared at him. "You never mentioned that. You never asked. Where did you move it?" The desk was crowded. "I put it on the lower shelf beneath the returns tray." Lucy frowned. "No, you didn't." Pritchard looked surprised. "I assure you I did. The Harcourt book was still on top of the desk after you left." For a moment neither spoke. Then Pritchard's expression changed. Reeves waited. "I may be confusing it with another brown volume." The answer was innocent enough, but it demonstrated something important. By midday, nobody could reliably say where the Harcourt book had been at any particular moment. Miss Marple asked a different question. "Did Mr. Vale seem frightened when he visited you on Tuesday?" Pritchard considered it. "No. Excited? Perhaps secretive?" "Yes, very." That fitted Edmund Vale better. He had discovered something and wanted to confirm it before revealing it. The investigation paused when a telephone call came from the county laboratory. Dr. Hayward took it in Mrs. Hartley's office. returning several minutes later with an expression that immediately silenced the room. The poison had been identified. It was a concentrated preparation containing aconitine derived from monkshood. Mrs. Hartley stared at him. "There is monkshood in my garden." Reeves looked at her sharply. "So there is," Dr. Hayward said, "but extracting a sufficiently concentrated dose would require some knowledge and preparation." Lucy spoke quietly. "Mrs. Crane grows it too." Mrs. Crane gave her a cold look. "So du hast die etwas true." Monkshood was hardly exotic in an English garden. More important was how it had entered Vale's tea. The laboratory had found no trace in the remaining sugar from the bowl. Reeves frowned. "Then it wasn't the sugar, not the bowl," Hayward said. "Vale's cup contained a substantial dose, but the communal sugar appears clean. Someone had poisoned the cup individually." That seemed to return attention to Lucy, who had carried it. She went pale. "I didn't put anything in it." Mrs. Hartley unexpectedly came to her defense. "She couldn't have. I watched her pick up the tray. Could something have been added afterward?" Vale carried the cup directly into the reading room. Reeves considered the room. Was he alone? "As far as we know," Miss Marple's needle stopped. "As far as we know," she repeated. Reeves looked at her. "You think someone entered?" "I think we are assuming the poison was placed in the tea after it was poured." Dr. Hayward understood first. "It could have been in the cup beforehand." Mrs. Hartley stared toward the kitchen. The cups had been arranged upside down on a wooden rack throughout the day. Anyone entering the kitchen could have prepared one in advance, but that created another difficulty. How would the killer know which cup Vale would receive? Reeves asked. "Nobody Lucy did. His hot turn." "What?" "Mr. Vale always used the same one." She pointed toward the evidence tray. Vale's cup was white porcelain with a narrow blue line around the rim. There were several similar cups in the library kitchen, but only one had a tiny chip near the handle. He complained about the others. Lucy explained. He said the handles were too small. Mrs. Hartley always gave him that one. Miss Marple looked toward Mrs. Hartley. The librarian nodded reluctantly. It was another ordinary habit everyone had overlooked. Someone familiar with the library could have known exactly which cup Vale would use. Reeves now had 3 separate threads: the hidden paper, the missing book, and the prepared cup. The temptation was to force them immediately toward the same person. Miss Marple resisted it. She asked to see the kitchen. Inside, everything was exactly as Mrs. Hartley had described. Cups hung from hooks above the counter. Sugar stood beside the kettle. Tea tins occupied a narrow cupboard. Miss Marple examined the chipped cup's empty hook. Then she looked at the small waste basket beneath the sink. There were tea wrappers, a broken pencil, several scraps of paper, and the remains of that morning's post. Nothing remarkable. She turned to leave, then stopped. "Mrs. Hartley, when do you wash the cups?" "After closing. So Mr. Vale's cup would have been here since yesterday." "Yes, and anyone who came into the kitchen this morning could have reached it." "I suppose so." Miss Marple nodded. Reeves began listing everyone who might have entered. Lucy certainly had. Mrs. Hartley had. Reverend Pritchard admitted stepping inside to leave a jar of church fete marmalade. Colonel Fenton said he had not. Mrs. Crane also denied it. Then Miss Marple asked a question that seemed almost trivial. Who brought the milk? Mrs. Hartley looked puzzled. Mr. Fenton did. The Colonel turned toward her. "You asked me too?" "Yes, this afternoon." "You came back from the grocer just before 4. Everyone looked at Fenton. His earlier statement had omitted that completely. Fenton frowned. I left the bottle on the kitchen counter, so you entered the kitchen, Reeves said. For perhaps 10 seconds, and you knew which cup Vale used. No, Miss Marple regarded him gently. But you knew he took tea without milk? Fenton looked at her. She continued before he could answer. You told Mrs. Hartley not to bother pouring milk into his cup before she had mentioned which cup was his. The Colonel's face became rigid. It was not proof that he had poisoned Edmund Vale. But it was proof that he had been paying much closer attention to Vale's tea than he had admitted. And, for the first time, Miss Marple looked not at the missing book, but directly at Colonel Fenton. Colonel Fenton did not attempt another denial. Perhaps he understood that each omission had made the next one look worse. Or perhaps he had finally realized that Miss Marple was less interested in catching him in a lie than in understanding why he had thought the lie necessary. I knew which cup he used, he said. Reeves waited. How? Because I had taken tea with him here before. You told me you barely spoke to the man. I said I disliked him. That is not the same thing. Fenton walked toward the fireplace and stood with his back to it. An old military habit that made the room seem temporarily like his own. Vale came to see me last week. He asked about Samuel Crane, and I refused to discuss it. 2 days later, we met here. He bought me tea, if you can call library tea buying someone anything, and tried again. What did he want to know? Whether Samuel had been in England after 1948, and was he? Fenton looked at Mrs. Crane. Yes, she stared at him. You said you couldn't remember. I remembered perfectly. The room went quiet. Fenton explained that in the spring of 1950, when he was a young lieutenant home on leave, he had seen Samuel Crane in St. Mary Mead. Samuel had asked him not to mention the encounter because his family believed he was still abroad. Why? He didn't tell me. Yet 2 years earlier he had supposedly died in Belgium, Reeves said. I did not know that at the time. When did you learn? Years later. And you still said nothing? What would you have had me say? That I had seen a dead man walking through the village, Mrs. Crane interrupted. My husband inherited Samuel's property? Yes. If Samuel was alive, Charles had no right to it, possibly. Her voice became strained. Then why did you never tell him? Fenton looked at her with something closer to pity than hostility. Because Charles knew that landed differently from every previous revelation. Mrs. Crane sat perfectly still. Fenton continued. Samuel Crane had disappeared after becoming involved in serious financial trouble. His supposed death abroad allowed several obligations to be settled and his property to pass quietly through the family. According to Fenton, Charles Crane had known his uncle was alive and had helped maintain the deception. Mrs. Crane shook her head. No, I'm sorry. You're lying. I wish I were. Reeves asked how Fenton knew. Samuel told me. During the encounter in 1950? Yes. Why tell you? He had been drinking. Samuel often became confidential when he drank. And this is what Vale discovered? I think so. The inheritance now supplied a strong motive for Mrs. Crane, but Fenton had acquired one of his own. If he had known about a fraudulent death for decades and deliberately concealed it, Vale could expose him as a participant, or at least as a witness who had remained silent. Yet Miss Marple did not pursue either possibility. Instead she asked, did Samuel mention Reverend Harcourt? Fenton looked surprised. Yes. Mrs. Crane turned toward him. What did he say? That Harcourt had helped him. Helped him how? I don't know. Samuel said something about the old fool being more useful than he looked. Miss Marple glanced toward the empty shelf. The connection was finally becoming visible. Harcourt had not merely written a book containing a photograph of Samuel. He had personally known something about Samuel's disappearance. Vale had apparently discovered that connection. Reeves asked whether Fenton had seen the folded paper Lucy described. No. Did you take the Harcourt book? No. Did you poison Vale's cup? No. This time the answers sounded different. There was no hesitation because perhaps Fenton had finally reached the things he truly had not done. Miss Marple seemed to think so as well. She turned toward Lucy. My dear, when you saw the folded paper inside the book, did you notice whether there was writing on it? Lucy frowned. I only saw one corner. Was it completely yellow? I think so. Not white on one side. No. Mrs. Hartley looked puzzled. Does that matter? It might. Miss Marple asked Reverend Pritchard what Reverend Harcourt's surviving papers looked like. Mostly old cream stationery, rather poor quality. It has yellowed badly, and his handwriting? Large and untidy. Miss Marple nodded. Éphémère. Vale found an old Harcourt document. He may have hidden it inside Harcourt's own book simply because that was where he found it. Reeves frowned. You think the paper was already in the book when he borrowed it? No. Lucy said it had been pushed deeply near the spine, and Mr. Vale was unusually insistent that he had returned the volume. That suggests he knew something important was inside when he brought it back. Why return evidence to a public library? Perhaps because he did not wish to keep it at home. Why? Because someone might search his home. The suggestion produced another silence. Vale had not behaved like a man casually researching an old inheritance. He had behaved like a solicitor protecting a document while deciding what to do with it. Reeves sent another constable to search Vale's cottage. While they waited, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Hartley whether anyone had requested the Harcourt book during the 9 days Vale had borrowed. It? Mrs. Hartley checked the reservation slips. No. Did anyone ask when it was due back? Mrs. Hartley started to say no, then stopped. Someone did. Who? She searched her memory. Mr. Mercer. Reeves looked up. Who is Miss Daniel Mercer's? He lives at Yew Tree Cottage. Miss Marple knew him. Everyone did. Daniel Mercer was a retired chemist in his early 60s who had moved to St. Marymead 5 years earlier. He was quiet, polite and useful at village events because he could repair almost anything mechanical. He also maintained one of the finest gardens in the village, including, Miss Marple remembered, a long border of monkshood. When did he ask? Reeves said. Monday. What exactly did he say? He wanted to know when the Harcourt volume would be returned. Did he say why? He said he was interested in old photographs of the village. Reeves's expression sharpened. Was he here today? Mrs. Hartley shook her head. Then Lucy spoke. Yes, he was. Mrs. Hartley turned. When? This morning. While you were in the office, the room seemed to contract around that answer. Lucy explained that Mercer had entered shortly before noon. He did not borrow anything. He spoke to her briefly, asked whether the rain was expected to continue, and left after perhaps 3 minutes. Did he approach the desk? Reeves asked. Yes. Was the Harcourt book there? Lucy stared at him. I don't know. You have been very certain about where it was at other times. I was sorting cards. I didn't watch him every second. Did you tell him Vale had returned it? No. Did he ask? No. That was more interesting than if he had. Mercer had previously asked when the book would return, yet on the very morning it apparently did. He entered the library and did not ask about it. Miss Marple's expression changed almost imperceptibly. What did Mr. Mercer do while he was here? Lucy thought. He looked at the notice board. Anything else? He went toward the back. The shelves, I suppose. The kitchen? Lucy hesitated. I couldn't see him for a minute. Reeves was already reaching for his coat. The pieces aligned almost too neatly. Mercer had knowledge of chemistry, access to monkshood, interest in the Harcourt book, and an unexplained opportunity to enter the kitchen on the morning Vale's distinctive cup could have been prepared. But Miss Marple remained seated. Reeves noticed, "You don't think it's Mercer?" "I think Mr. Mercer should certainly be questioned. That isn't what I asked." No, Reeves waited. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "The difficulty with people who conceal things, Constable, is that we begin to assume everything they conceal belongs to the same secret." She glanced toward Mrs. Crane. Then Fenton, then Lucy. Mrs. Crane concealed her fear about the inheritance. Colonel Fenton concealed his knowledge of Samuel. Lucy concealed what she saw because she wished to protect Mrs. Hartley. None of those secrets necessarily killed Mr. Vale. And Mercer? We do not yet know what he is concealing. A constable returned from Vale's cottage before Reeves could leave. The search had found no poison and no Harcourt book. But inside Vale's desk was a sealed envelope addressed to Constable Reeves. Reeves opened it. The note inside was brief. Vale wrote that he had uncovered evidence concerning Samuel Crane and intended to speak to the police. After confirming the identity of another person connected with the matter. If anything happened to him first, Reeves was to examine Reverend Harcourt's original memorandum. There was no memorandum in the envelope, only one additional sentence. Vale had written that he would place it somewhere no one interested in the Crane photograph would think to look. Reeves read the line twice. Then everyone looked toward the empty space on the shelf. Everyone except Miss Marple. She was looking at Mrs. Hartley. The librarian had gone completely pale. Not when Samuel Crane was mentioned. Not when the poison was identified. Not when Mercer's name entered the investigation. Only now, when Vale's words confirmed that the missing paper was Reverend Harcourt's memorandum. Miss Marple approached her quietly. "You knew what it was, didn't you?" Mrs. Hartley's lips trembled. "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded. "I know, my dear." Mrs. Hartley looked at her in astonishment. Then, with shaking hands, she reached beneath the circulation desk and removed a small brass key. "The book isn't missing," she whispered. Reeves stood. Mrs. Hartley crossed to the locked cupboard containing damaged and valuable volumes, opened it, and moved aside a stack of old atlases. Behind them lay the Harcourt book. She had hidden it herself. Reeves took the volume and opened it carefully. The folded yellow paper was gone. Mrs. Hartley remained beside the locked cupboard while Reeves examined the Harcourt volume page by page. Nothing had been torn out, and the photograph of the 1950 village fete remained exactly where Mrs. Crane had described it, showing several dozen villagers gathered beneath strings of bunting. Near the back stood a thin man whose face resembled the younger Samuel Crane. The photograph mattered. But Vale's note had already told them it was not the thing he had been trying to protect. Reeves closed the book. "Why did you hide it?" Mrs. Hartley sat down. "Because I found the paper." "When?" "This morning." Lucy stared at her. "You told me you never saw it." "I know." Mrs. Hartley explained that after Reverend Pritchard left, she picked up the Harcourt volume to record its return properly. When she opened it, the folded memorandum slipped partly from the spine. She read it. Not because she expected anything important, but because an old document hidden inside a library book naturally attracted the curiosity of a librarian. Reverend Harcourt had written the memorandum in 1951. It described a man who had approached him the previous year asking for help obtaining baptismal records and identification papers under another name. That man was Samuel Crane. Harcourt had helped him. Later, however, Harcourt discovered something disturbing. Samuel Crane was not merely escaping debts. He intended to assume the identity of a distant relative who had died overseas and whose death had not yet been registered in England. Harcourt, horrified by his own involvement, recorded the truth privately. "Why hide the book?" Reeves asked. Mrs. Hartley looked toward Lucy. Because there was another name in the memorandum, Lucy became very still. Thomas Bell. Her father, Mrs. Hartley, nodded. According to Harcourt, Thomas Bell, then a young clerk working for a local solicitor, had witnessed Samuel signing documents under the false identity. Harcourt believed Thomas had later been paid to remain silent. Lucy looked devastated. "My father wouldn't. I didn't know what to believe," Mrs. Hartley said. "I only knew what people in this village would say if they read it, so you removed the memorandum." "No," Reeves's expression hardened. "You expect me to believe you hid the book to protect Lucy's father, but left the document inside?" "Yes, I thought if the book disappeared for a day or two, I could decide what to do. I locked it away exactly as it was. Then, where is the paper?" "I don't know." Lucy looked at Mrs. Hartley. "You did that for me?" Mrs. Hartley's voice softened. "For your father. And perhaps for you." Miss Marple had been studying the photograph while they spoke. "Mrs. Hartley, when you read the memorandum, did it say what name Samuel intended to use?" The librarian hesitated. "Yes, what was it?" "Edward Mercer." Nobody spoke. Reeves turned slowly toward Miss Marple. "Daniel Mercer, Edward Mercer." The connection was close enough to demand attention, but Miss Marple did not treat it as proof. Was Edward Mercer a real person? She asked. Mrs. Hartley nodded. Harcourt wrote that he was Samuel's cousin. He had died in Malaya. Reeves understood. If Samuel Crane became Edward Mercer, Daniel Mercer could be connected to him. Possibly, Miss Marple said. Reeves sent a constable immediately to Yew Tree Cottage with instructions to bring Daniel Mercer to the library. While they waited, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Hartley to describe precisely what she had done after reading the memorandum. She folded it along its existing creases, placed it back inside the book, and carried the volume to the locked cupboard. "Did anyone see you?" "I thought not." "Where was Lucy?" "In the storeroom, Colonel Fenn. Gone me Mrs. Crane." "Gone, Mr. Mercer?" Mrs. Hartley stopped. "I don't know," Lucy answered. "He came in afterward." Miss Marple nodded. That was important. If Mercer had watched Mrs. Hartley move the book, he could have known where it was hidden. But the cupboard was locked, Reeves said. Mrs. Hartley looked at the brass key. The key normally hangs beneath the desk. Reeves stared at her. Where anyone could take it? For a minute or two, yes, the missing memorandum no longer required an impossible theft. Mercer had entered while Mrs. Hartley was occupied and Lucy was sorting cards. He could have taken the key, opened the cupboard, removed the document and returned everything before leaving. Yet one question remained. Why leave the book? Miss Marple supplied the answer. Because by then Mrs. Hartley had already hidden it. If the book remained where she placed it, she would naturally continue pretending it had never been returned. Mrs. Hartley looked horrified. And Mr. Vale would blame me. Yes, the missing book had served to different purposes for two different people. Mrs. Hartley hid it to protect Lucy. Someone else removed the memorandum and allowed the disappearance of the book to conceal that second action. That was why the case had seemed unnecessarily complicated. At 8:15, Daniel Mercer entered the library accompanied by a constable. He appeared exactly as he always did in the village, composed, courteous, and mildly inconvenienced. He removed his wet coat. Unlike Colonel Fenton's umbrella earlier, Mercer's coat was genuinely soaked. I understand you have questions. Reeves placed the Harcourt book on the desk. Mercer looked at it, only briefly, but Miss Marple noticed something. He did not look surprised to see it. You asked when this book would be returned. Reeves said, I did. Why? I told Mrs. Hartley. I wanted to see the photographs, which photograph Mercer paused. The village fete? Which year? Another pause. I don't remember. Mrs. Crane spoke from beside the fireplace, 1950. Mercer glanced at her. That glance was small, but personal. Not the reaction of a man hearing an irrelevant date. Reeves asked whether he knew Samuel Crane. No. Edward Mercer? My father. The answer changed everything without changing Mercer's expression. His father, he explained, had spent much of his life abroad and died when Daniel was young. Where? Singapore. When? 1969. Reeves placed Vale's note beside the book. We have reason to believe Edward Mercer died before 1950. Mercer smiled faintly. Then your reason is wrong, or Samuel Crane assumed his identity. Mercer said nothing. Miss Marple watched his hands. They remained steady. Reeves pressed him about the morning visit, the cupboard and the missing memorandum. Mercer denied touching the book. He denied taking the key. He denied knowing about Harcourt's memorandum. Then Reeves mentioned the poison. For the first time, Mercer's composure altered, only slightly. Aconitine, Reeves said. Placed in Mr. Vale's particular cup before the tea was poured, Mercer looked toward the kitchen. It was instinctive. And it was revealing. Reeves noticed. You know the kitchen? I have been in it before. You were in it this morning. No, Lucy Bell could not see you for nearly a minute. I was examining the shelves. Which shelves? Mercer hesitated. Miss Marple spoke before Reeves could continue. The interesting thing, Mr. Mercer, is that nobody has told you where Mr. Vale was poisoned. Mercer looked at her. You said his cup. Yes, you did not say the cup came from the library kitchen. Silence followed. Mercer's face remained controlled, but the control itself now looked deliberate. He answered carefully. Where else would a library keep cups? It was a reasonable response, almost. Miss Marple smiled gently. Quite. Reeves searched Mercer's coat and pockets. Nothing was found. A constable searching you, Tree Cottage, later telephoned with more promising information. Mercer kept pharmaceutical equipment from his former profession, and dried monkshood was found in a labelled container in his garden shed. There were also old documents belonging to Edward Mercer. Still, Miss Marple cautioned Reeves. That establishes opportunity and knowledge. It does not establish what happened. You think he killed Vale. I think we must understand the behaviour before we decide what it means. Reeves looked frustrated. What behaviour? Miss Marple turned toward the tea tray. Mr. Mercer could have prepared Vale's cup this morning, certainly. But he could not know with certainty that Vale would return this afternoon. Mrs. Hartley looked up. He could. Everyone turned toward her. Mr. Vale told me this morning that he would come back after 3 if I had not telephoned him first. Why would you telephone him? To tell him whether anyone asked for the Harcourt book after he returned it. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. There it was. Vale had not returned the memorandum merely to hide it. He had used the book as bait. He wanted to know who was waiting for it. Mercer had already asked when the book was due back. If he appeared after its return, Vale would know whom to investigate. But Mercer had arrived before Mrs. Hartley could telephone Vale. He had found the book hidden, taken the memorandum, and realized that Vale had set a trap. That explained why Vale returned angrily in the afternoon. He expected the book to be on the shelf. Instead, it had vanished. He did not know Mrs. Hartley had hidden it. Mercer, however, did. Miss Marple walked to the reading room doorway and looked inside. Then she turned toward Lucy. When you carried Mr. Vale's tea, was the chipped cup already on the tray? Yes, and Mr. Mercer had left hours earlier. Yes, Miss Marple nodded. The poison, therefore, had to be placed in the cup that morning, before anyone knew with absolute certainty that Vale would drink from it that afternoon. Unless the killer knew Vale's plan, Reeves looked toward Mercer. Vale had told Mrs. Hartley he would return. Mrs. Hartley had not told Mercer. But someone had overheard Vale say it that morning. Lucy suddenly remembered. When Mr. Vale said he would come back after 3, Mr. Mercer was standing by the notice board. Mercer closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. It was the smallest surrender imaginable. Miss Marple saw it. So did Reeves. Every necessary fact was now in the room, the memorandum, the false identity. Mercer's interest in the book, his morning visit, his knowledge of chemistry, the distinctive cup, Vale's announced return, and the disappearance that had initially seemed to concern nothing more serious than a misplaced library volume. The truth had not arrived late. It had been present before Edmund Vale even drank his tea. The only thing still required was to arrange those ordinary facts in the correct order. Reeves asked Daniel Mercer to sit down, but Mercer remained standing beside the circulation desk. His wet coat folded over one arm and his expression composed once more. Whatever brief reaction Lucy's statement had produced was gone. "You believe I poisoned Vale's cup this morning?" he said. Reeves did not answer immediately. "You knew he would," he sighed at last. "You knew which cup he used. You had access to aconitine and the knowledge required to prepare it. You also had a reason to remove Harcourt's memorandum, a collection of assumptions, rather a lot of them, but still. Assumptions. Mercer was right, and that was precisely the difficulty. Opportunity could be demonstrated. Knowledge could be demonstrated. Motive was becoming clear. Yet none of them proved that Mercer had touched the cup. Miss Marple was standing near the local history shelves, looking again at the narrow rectangle of dust where the Harcourt volume had been. "Mr. Mercer is quite right," she said. Reeves turned. Mercer allowed himself the smallest smile. Miss Marple continued, "We have made one mistake from the beginning." "What mistake?" "We have been treating the missing book as though it were evidence of the murder." Mrs. Hartley frowned. "Wasn't it?" "No. Not originally." Miss Marple walked toward the circulation desk. Mr. Vale returned the Harcourt volume because he had hidden Reverend Harcourt's memorandum inside it. He then told Mrs. Hartley he would return that afternoon if she did not telephone him. He wanted to discover who was waiting for the book. She looked at Mercer. Mr. Mercer had already asked when it would be returned, which naturally made him interesting to Mr. Vale. Mercer said nothing. But something happened that Mr. Vale did not anticipate. Mrs. Hartley found the memorandum first. The librarian lowered her eyes. She read Thomas Bell's name and became frightened for Lucy, so she hid the entire book in the locked cupboard. Lucy looked toward her. Miss Marple continued. When Mr. Mercer arrived, the book was no longer on the desk. But he had been waiting for its return, and he knew enough to look for it. Reeves nodded. He took the memorandum, almost certainly. Mercer smiled again. Almost. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, almost. For a moment it seemed that she had reached the same obstacle as Reeves. Then she turned toward Mrs. Hartley. "When Mr. Vale came back this afternoon, what exactly did he say first?" Mrs. Hartley thought. "He said, 'I returned it this morning.' And then?" "I told him he hadn't." "No, my dear." After that, Mrs. Hartley closed her eyes, reconstructing the argument. "He said, the Harcourt volume..." I put it directly into your hands. Miss Marple nodded, and when he looked at the shelf, Mrs. Hartley remembered. He said someone had taken it. Exactly. Reeves looked impatient. We heard all of that. Yes, Miss Marple said, but we heard it incorrectly. She turned toward Mercer. Mr. Vale believed the book itself had been stolen. Because it wasn't on the shelf, Reeves said. Precisely. Which means he did not know Mrs. Hartley had hidden it. That we already established, yes, but consider what follows. Miss Marple's voice remained mild. If Mr. Vale believed the book had been stolen, then he also believed the memorandum was still inside it. Reeves stopped. Mrs. Hartley looked up. Miss Marple continued. He had no reason to think anyone had removed only the paper. As far as he knew, whoever had discovered his trap had taken the entire volume. Mercer's expression had changed, only slightly. But this time there was nowhere for the change to hide. Miss Marple looked directly at him. And, therefore, Mr. Mercer, there was no reason to kill Edmund Vale. Reeves stared at her. Mercer did not move. Not yet, Miss Marple added. The room remained silent. If you had taken the memorandum in the morning and believed Vale knew you had taken it, then poisoning him might make sense. But Vale did not know. His argument with Mrs. Hartley proved that. He thought the book and the memorandum had disappeared together. Reeves understood. So Mercer could simply have left. Yes. Then why poison him? Miss Marple looked toward the reading room. Because the murder was not committed to conceal the memorandum. That was the turn nobody had expected, although everything necessary to understand it had already been said. Mercer's interest in the book had made him look like the murderer. His chemistry had made him look like the murderer. His access to monkshood had made him look like the murderer. But those facts had caused everyone to combine to separate crimes into one. The theft of the memorandum and the murder of Edmund Vale were connected. They were not committed for the same reason. Miss Marple turned toward Colonel Fenton. You knew Mr. Vale took tea without milk. Fenton's face hardened. We have discussed that. Yes, and we accepted your explanation because you admitted having tea with him here. Previously. I did. You also brought the milk this afternoon. Mrs. Hartley asked me to. She did. Miss Marple smiled faintly. But you told us something much earlier, Colonel, before any of us understood its importance. Fenton said nothing. When Mr. Vale entered the reading room, he took your newspaper. Reeves looked toward the reading room table. Fenton had objected. Vale had replied that he would return it. A meaningless little exchange, or so it had seemed. Miss Marple continued. You followed him, didn't you? No, you did not need to remain there long. I never entered that room. Miss Marple shook her head. I think you did, because Mr. Vale had something you desperately wanted to know. Fenton's voice became harder. What? Whether the memorandum named you? Nobody moved. Fenton had known Samuel Crane was alive. He had known about the false death. He had concealed that knowledge for decades. But until that afternoon, he did not know exactly what Reverend Harcourt had written. Mr. Mercer stole the memorandum, Miss Marple said, but you did not know that. You believed it was still somewhere in Mr. Vale's possession. Fenton glanced toward Mercer. That glance was enough. Miss Marple went on. You lied about your morning visit because you feared being connected with Samuel Crane. You lied about how well you knew Vale because you did not want us to know he had been questioning you. Then you brought the milk and entered the kitchen, but that was not when the poison was placed in the cup. Reeves frowned. But the cup had to be prepared before the tea was poured. No, Dr. Hayward looked at her. Then he understood. The cup contained aconitine. We never established that the empty cup contained it before the tea. Miss Marple nodded. Everyone had accepted the theory because it explained how a particular cup could be targeted, but it had remained only a theory. Vale had carried his tea into the reading room. Then Colonel Fenton's newspaper gave Fenton a perfectly natural reason to follow him. "You went to retrieve it," Miss Marple said. Or that is what you would have said if anyone saw you. Fenton's face had lost its colour. "You had the poison with you because you had already considered killing him, but you had not yet decided whether it was necessary. You followed Vale and asked what Harcourt had written about Samuel. No, Vale would not tell you." Fenton's hands tightened. "He enjoyed knowing things about people," Miss Marple continued. "You told us that yourself. Knowing things was not enough for him. He liked people to know that he knew." The description had sounded like simple dislike when Fenton first offered it. Now it became testimony. "He told you enough to make you believe your own silence could be exposed." Fenton looked toward the floor. Miss Marple's voice softened. "You had spent decades convincing yourself that you had merely kept quiet about another family's dishonesty. But Harcourt's memorandum could make it appear that you had helped preserve the fraud." Mrs. Crane stared at him. "Arthur?" Fenton did not answer. "You added the aconitine directly to the tea while Vale was distracted," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps when he turned toward the desk, perhaps when he unfolded your newspaper. It required only a moment." Reeves stepped toward him. "And Mercer, he stole the memorandum," Miss Marple said. "That is why he behaved like a guilty man." "He was guilty, just not of the murder." Mercer's composure finally collapsed. "My father was Samuel Crane." Mrs. Crane closed her eyes. Mercer continued quietly. "He raised me as Daniel Mercer. I discovered the truth after his death. Vale had begun uncovering it, and I wanted the memorandum destroyed. So you took it?" Reeves asked. "Yes. Where is it?" "Burned." Reeves turned back to Fenton. The colonel seemed suddenly older. "I only wanted Vale to stop," he said. Nobody answered. "I asked him what he intended to do." He laughed. Fenton looked toward the reading room. "He said that by tomorrow several people in St. Mary Mead would discover how expensive an old memory could become that fitted Vale perfectly. And it was enough." Fenton admitted carrying a small bottle of aconitine preparation because he had taken it from his garden shed earlier, that day after deciding he might need to frighten Vale into silence. In the reading room, anger and fear completed what preparation had begun. He poured a concentrated amount into the tea while Vale turned to unfold the newspaper. Then he left. "Heute Vale was dead." Reeves led Fenton away shortly before 9. Mercer would also have questions to answer, although not for murder. Mrs. Crane remained beside the fireplace, absorbing the knowledge that much of her marriage had rested upon a deception she had never understood. Lucy sat beside Mrs. Hartley, no longer concerned with what an old memorandum had said about her father. Because Harcourt's account had never established that Thomas Bell knowingly participated in the fraud. The rain had stopped. Miss Marple collected her knitting. Reeves approached her before she left. "I was certain it was Mercer, so was Mr. Fenton. I imagine." Reeves frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple glanced toward the Harcourt book. "Mr. Fenmercer Bevjust A.S. Weedit." He probably assumed Mercer had taken the book and would eventually be blamed for whatever followed, and the missing book. That was the unfortunate little accident which helped everybody. Everybody? Mrs. Hartley used it to protect Lucy. Mr. Mercer used it to conceal the theft of the memorandum. Colonel Fenton used the confusion surrounding it to conceal his real reason for approaching Mr. Vale, and we used it to build a theory that was much more complicated than the truth. Reeves looked at the empty space on the shelf. "So what gave Fenton away?" Miss Marple smiled. "Nothing gave him away, Constable. That was the difficulty. She put on her coat. We kept asking who had the best opportunity to prepare Mr. Vale's cup. When we should have remembered the simplest thing we were told at the very beginning. What thing? Mr. Vale carried his tea into an unlocked room. Miss Marple glanced once toward the reading room. The door was never locked, and nobody ever said he was alone outside. Water still dripped from the roofs of St. Mary Mead, and the village looked much as it had before Edmund Vale entered the library that afternoon. By the following morning, the Harcourt volume had been returned to its proper place. The narrow rectangle of clean shelf disappeared behind its faded brown cover, and to anyone who had not been there was nothing remarkable to see. That was perhaps the most unsettling part of the whole affair. The missing book had attracted everyone's attention because it was absent. The open door had attracted nobody's attention because it had been there all along.